there'd be a lot of interest in a program about water. Yeah, how many people here like to drink water? Right. Before I introduce our speaker, Mark Hamilton, I would like to take a few minutes to get a feel for who all is here. So bear with me for a couple of questions, please. How many of you are attending your first CCCA program? Wow. Wow, way more than that. Thank you. For y'all. But how many of you are in the Friends of CCCA group and have been coming to meetings for a while? Yay for all of you guys, too. Well, for all you new ones, I'm really interested in how the word got out and how you've heard about it, because it's going to help us reach more people in the community. How many of you saw an announcement in a newspaper or an online newspaper? You have them right. Oh, almost. Okay, I'm sorry, keep on. Raise your hand and I don't look. Okay, newspaper. Good, good. Great percentage. Testing. Okay, there she is. All right, and how many of you saw an announcement from some other organization's newsletter? Another group. Oh, see, more of you heard from other organizations you're in than in a newspaper. All right, how many heard about it on Facebook? All right. Nextdoor. We've been posting on Nextdoor. Nextdoor. All right, we'll keep doing that. And if any of you are on Nextdoor and like to post, be sure to repost. Is that what we call it? All right, and did anybody see a flyer in the library, in a library? Oh, Roxana, we got to talk to those people. Thank you. That helps us to know where we need to work a little harder to reach more people, because this is the point of naming the organization the Comal County Conservation Alliance, is that it was supposed to cover the entire county. We're working in the entire county and we're trying to reach people all over. All right, so I hope y'all have signed in. If anybody did not sign in on the way in, please sign in on your way out, okay? We'd like to get you on our Friends of CCCA list. And if anybody asks, once you've come to any of our meetings and signed up, you are a friend of CCCA, right? Okay, we have 3 of our committee chairs here tonight. And I'd like to introduce them so that you might be able to talk with them later, to find them in the crowd and talk with them later. We have both of our Government Affairs Committee co-chairs here. Roxana Dean, would you stand up and wave? There's Roxana. And Dirk Davidek, there he is, hiding behind the pillar. Get a good look at those folks, because after the program is over this evening, on your way out, you might want to stop and talk to them about what the committee is doing and how you might want to help. We also have Stephen Granger here tonight, co-chair of our outreach committee. Wave to the nice people, Stephen. There he is. You can talk to him on the way out too. We're doing a lot of outreach. There's a lot of fun things going on in the community that we like to get involved in, meet new people. So I had a couple other things that we won't even bother because I'm getting off to a late start. Thank you for your patience. We just didn't have enough chairs and couldn't get going. But let's go on. Without further ado, I'd like to start the program for tonight. We're very honored to have with us tonight Mark Hamilton, Executive Director of Aquifer Management Services for the Edwards Aquifer Authority. I'm going to read most of this introduction because there's so many big words in it that I would have forgotten if I didn't have my notes here. But Mark is here tonight to talk to us about the hot topic of water. With the drought and the high summer temperatures we're experiencing, Mark's timing couldn't have been any better, could it? Water is the one thing that's probably on everybody's mind right now, right after the heat. We're wondering things like, is there going to be enough water in the aquifer to support all the new wells that are going in Comal County? And how about this one from people like me? Will my 40-year-old well continue to draw water, or will we have to re-drill and go deeper? And will it do any good to go deeper? It depends. All right, well, just wanted you to be prepared for some of the questions that may come up later. Mark is the Executive Director of Aquifer Management System Services for the Edwards Aquifer Authority, or EAA as we know it. As part of the executive leadership team, Mark oversees the Aquifer Management Services Division, which includes the EAA's research, data collection, modeling, and sustainability programming, all of which help support the agency's mission to manage, enhance, and protect the Edwards Aquifer system. Mark is a registered professional geoscientist in the state of Texas, and since joining the EAA in 2002, has worked as a senior hydrogeologist, supervisor, and manager in the Aquifer Science and Research Program. In his current role, Mark focuses on developing and sustaining the highest levels of professionalism, integrity, collaboration, and innovation throughout the agency's science-based programs and practices, ensuring that the best available science is used to inform the policies and programs of the EAA. In addition to his managerial role, Mark has testified before the Edwards Aquifer Legislative Oversight Committee in Austin, briefing their members on the benefits the EAA Act has provided to the region. Most recently, Mark has been charged with responsibility for the Edwards Aquifer Authority's Field Research Park, a 150-acre property in northern Bexar County along the Bexar-Comal County line. The Field Research Park is EAA's focal point for research aimed at testing groundwater sustainability practices and conducting other groundwater-related studies, including land management techniques. See what I mean? That's a mouthful. He's got a lot of stuff going on. So at this time, please join me in welcoming Mark Hamilton.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm really not sure who wrote all that. It wasn't me. So there's a lot to talk about, and there's no way that in 30 or 45 minutes or an hour that we can really cover everything, but I will do the best that I can. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I put together this presentation over the last couple of weeks, working on it off and on. I really tried to put a lot of thought into giving you a lot of information without going too far into the weeds. I just want to kind of introduce some of the things that we're doing, what our hopes and dreams, if you want to think of it that way, might be for some sustainability practices, but realizing there's no easy answers necessarily, right? We do the best we can, but there's not always an easy answer or a quick answer. So to give you kind of an idea of just 5 points that I really want to talk about a little bit tonight. Who are we? Who's the Edwards Aquifer Authority? What's the importance of managing a resource? What is the Edwards Aquifer? What are a few interesting facts about how it works and why? And then, given the weather and given all of the numerous new license plates that don't have Texas on them, I thought it would be appropriate to talk about drought and growth just for a few minutes. And I really want to spend the majority of the time talking about some things that are a little bit more positive, and that is some of our new sustainability practices that we're trying to figure out and implement over time. So I'd also like to point out and recognize that one of my board members is here, Director Walton. So thank you for being here. I hope it doesn't impact my annual raise. I'm going to have to do that. So in a nutshell, so the mission of the EAA is to manage, enhance, and protect the Edwards Aquifer system. And we have to do that within the guidelines of what we call the EAA Act. So our enabling legislation that we have to play within those rules, if you will. But we do have the charge to manage, enhance, and protect the aquifer system. So how do we go about doing that? Well, one of the key components to our agency that makes us different than other groundwater agencies across the state perhaps, we have a permitting system that was our first order of business when we were creators, to put this permit system in place. And through that permit system, we have about 1,200 permits. We serve about 2 million plus users in the Edwards Aquifer system. So that's from Uvalde all the way to the northern end of Hayes County. It's that permitting system that was kind of integral to developing a management scheme for the system. If you can't manage the resource, it's very hard to have any certainty. So the permit system equates to 572,000 total acre feet of permits. So that's each year, those 1,200 permits, all added together, add up to 572,000. Well, that number is pretty important. That number is based on a lot of computer modeling, a lot of hard work, a lot of data collection. And that's the number that is sustainable. But that number is also subject to a number of different cutbacks and other management techniques to ensure that regional certainty. So before I go on, in case you haven't heard the term acre foot before, and probably most of the people here have, but an acre foot of water is merely the amount of water it takes to flood 1 acre of land 1 foot deep. So 325,851 gallons.
That's daily or yearly?
Sorry.
That daily or yearly? Is that a yearly?
Well, the permit, the 572 is annual. So I mentioned some cutbacks. So right now, today, J17 in the San Antonio pool is what we call stage 3. So those 1,200 permit holders are limited to 65% of their permit. So if you have 1,000 acre feet, you only get 65% of it under stage 3. If we get a flood tomorrow and everything goes back to good, then obviously stage 3 goes away, stage 2 goes away. But these different stages are all based on some very significant computer modeling and many years of computer modeling to make sure that we can sustain spring flows at Comal Springs during a repeat of the drought of the 50s. So it took, I would say it took a good 10 years of really hard work and a lot of very talented people to develop these numbers, and they work. So that brings us a level of certainty, right? That goes back to that management scheme. What other management practices are out there? So we have the permit system, we have the cap on that permit, and we have critical period reduction, stage 1 through 5. But there's other things that people have developed that are really fruitful. So if you've heard the term ASR, Aquifer Storage and Recovery, the San Antonio water systems developed an ASR, and they've got, I don't know, 150. I'm sure the number's wrong, but it's at least 150,000 acre feet of water stored in the Carrizo. So you can store that water offline. And when you have a drought, you bring it back and you reduce demand on the Edwards. That's a huge deal. It's a very functional way to, I call it peak shaving. When the aquifer levels are high, you take the peaks and you put them somewhere else, then you bring them back when you need them. The reason that doesn't work in the Edwards is a karst system. Water movement's very fast. You can't really store water for an extended period of time in a karst aquifer. But in the Carrizo, which is sand, that water moves about 3 to 5 centimeters a day. So you can count on it more or less being where you put it when you come back to get it. So what else do we do? So we have a number of different forbearance programs. So when certain conditions are met, and probably the best one or easiest one to explain, there's a program that we call VISPO. VISPO is Voluntary Irrigation Suspension Program. So we pay agricultural irrigators not to pump if J17 is below 635 on October 1st of any given year. The following year, the people enrolled in that program will get a check not to pump that water. So it's another way to maintain aquifer levels. Okay, now we can talk about the interesting stuff. Oh, I don't want to get into the weeds and bore everyone to tears, but I wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about, well, how does this aquifer work that we rely on so heavily? And it's kind of amazing. I've actually been studying the Edwards Aquifer since I was in graduate school. I did a number of years as a consultant because I like to make money. But I realized that making money also meant that I was always gone. And every time I would leave town for 2 or 3 weeks, inevitably my wife would wind up not being happy with me. Every time I would leave town, one of the kids would wind up in the hospital for something, it seemed like. So after a number of years of doing that, I finally thought, well, maybe I should find something where I can stay at home. So I got lucky enough to get a job at the EAA and got lucky enough that they let me hang around for a long time. So it's been a great deal for me. But I've always been fascinated by this aquifer. Every time I think I understand it, I realize that it has another surprise waiting for me. But what little bit I do know is it's such a unique system. So, you know, we have the hill country that we all love. Eventually, I'm going to figure out how to operate this. So the hill country, which is our drainage area, and then we have that kind of area between the hill country and I-35, if you want to think of it that way. That's the recharge zone where the Edwards is exposed at the surface. Then we have the artesian zone. So looking at it in cross section kind of helps you to understand, oh wow, so when it rains up here in the hill country, a lot of that water makes its way down to the recharge zone and eventually contributes to the Edwards Aquifer. It also contributes to the Plateau Aquifer, it contributes to the Trinity Aquifer. All those systems are connected, right? And the springs that flow in the hill country contribute to the different rivers that are in the hill country that flow across the recharge zone. So it's an amazing thing how people out west and people out north and people to the east, we're all connected by the same system. If you look at it in map view, it's about 22 different counties that are either all or part, and it's over 8,000 square miles. So I have 30 staff to cover our territory, which is not trivial, right? It's a lot. So one of the advantages of getting this thing we call the field research park is we have somewhere reasonably close by that we can do really fruitful and meaningful research without sending somebody to Real County, you know, to get data. So to me, this is a much easier way to think about it. The three components, the contributing zone or drainage area, whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. The recharge zone and the artesian zone. So the contributing zone is like a giant funnel that collects a whole lot of rainfall over a huge area. In fact, 62% of the total area of the aquifer system is contributing zone. That drains to the recharge zone, more or less. There's a little more to it than that, but it doesn't really, we don't need to dig that deep at the moment. But 3.5 million acres of the system belong to the contributing zone. Only 780,000 acres are actually recharge zone. And then the artesian zone, where the majority of the water is stored, is 1.3 million acres. So to me, it makes more sense to think of it as we got these three buckets, and if we actually tried to represent reality, we would have to draw about a dozen more things on there. But for the most part, this is representative of how the system works. So here's one of the things that I'm sure is certainly on everyone's mind. It's on mine. You know what? You can't hold a microphone and this thing at the same time. I can't. So drought's been around forever. It's not anything new, but it's certainly problematic, right? Not fun to deal with. There's some chance based on the best available technology and work conducted by people who are far smarter than I am, that climate change does appear to have some level of impact on the severity of droughts. Well, that could be a significant thing. And we're trying, part of my staff are working very hard to better understand how to downscale and apply global climate models to this region so that we can better understand how to prepare for the next 20, 30, and 50 years. And it's such a huge task. And I don't want to go too far down the pathway of talking about global climate models, but essentially one pixel in those models is bigger than our region. So downscaling that information into something useful is very hard to do. But we're making good progress on it, and we're hopeful that over the next couple of years, we'll have some very good technology in place to better understand, well, what should we plan for 20 years from now? So for our region right now, almost everything we do, a lot of our programs they're all focused around the 1950s drought. So even though I'm getting pretty old, I didn't live through that drought. I was born when it was over, just shortly after, but that was about a 10-year drought. In 1956, J17 got down to 612.5 feet. Comal Spring stopped flowing for about 6 months. It was pretty scary, right? And someone a long time ago, or several someones, had the foresight to collect data throughout that drought. Had they not done that, it would have been extremely difficult for us to build the computer models that we use now to develop the management schemes to provide the best level of certainty that we can for all the users. So serendipitous, I guess. So in my 20 years at the EAA, I've dealt with drought quite a lot. And what I started to find out is there's this really amazing barometer of drought in Medina County called Medina Lake. And it's really interesting to me because when I first started in my career, you had to pay a lot of money to get an aerial photograph. And now you can get them on your phone for free. If I would have had one of these fancy phones in college, I would have made A's. So Medina Lake, 2014, we all recall the drought, 2012, 13, 14, it was bad. So that's what Medina Lake looked like. Well, 4 years later, Medina Lake fills back up. Then 4 years later, it almost looks like it did in 2014. This is in March of this year. But it's a process, and that process is likely to continue. And Medina Lake's kind of unique because it has a fairly small drainage area for a lake that size, and it's an irrigation lake, and they have contracts to fulfill, and they're doing their job. So I'm not in any way trying to say something negative. It's just it provides a really nice visual indicator of, well, I wonder where we're at in terms of drought this year. So go to Google Earth and look at Medina Lake, you'll know. Okay, so just a little bit more because I've gotten kind of wrapped up over the last few months with drought and drought-related issues, and by the end of this presentation, I still won't be able to operate this clicker. So it's bad here, but we have a great management system in place, and we do have a level of certainty that a lot of places don't have. So think about the Western U.S. right now. Things are really bad out there, right? So if I lived in Las Vegas, I would be extremely worried. I would be looking for somewhere else to live right now. You know, Lake Mead it's not at, but it's getting reasonably close to Deadpool. And I'm not really sure what's going to happen if it gets there. Lake Powell is the same way. My youngest child just finished her master's degree, and she has this passion for the mountains. So she moved to Arizona. I'm like, why? One of the few places that's drier than it is here. But she likes it, so it's good for her. So some of the readings that I've done related to the Western U.S. drought is completely fascinates me. When they designed and built Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the thought was these are completely drought proof. There will never be a drought that impacts these lakes at a level that we have to worry about. Well, they never thought about 20-year droughts. Nobody had experienced that. And the thought was, well, these lakes are really deep. They hold vast quantities of water. Why should we be concerned? Well, as far as I know, they don't have a backup plan. So it's concerning. I would love to be able to have opportunity to talk to people who work in that arena just to hear their story, because I'm sure it's a very difficult time for them as well. All that drought stuff is certainly not related or not limited to the United States. You can do any search engine request for the country of Chile and drought, and you will get about 5,000 pages of hits. It's really bad there. In that country, water's all private. So their last dictator in the early 1980s had the bright idea to sell all of his buddies all the water. So in Chile, 2% of the water in the country is allocated to humans. The rest is allocated to industry. So they grow things like avocados in the desert. Takes 18 gallons of water to make one avocado. So that doesn't make sense to me, at least. It's bad enough that there's over 1 million people that subsist on 10 gallons of water a day in the country of Chile. So I would chalk a lot of that up to a lack of a true management scheme for their resources. I think they're learning. They've recently formed a constitutional convention. They're going to rewrite the Constitution and hopefully, reallocate the water. But I bring these things up only because it's not just here. It's so much worse in other places. What other stressors do we have that may apply to this region? So I did a little visit to the state demographer's website a couple of weeks ago, and I was actually kind of surprised by these numbers. And granted, I had to take calculus a couple of times to figure it out, but I can still do math, basic math. And if my numbers are right, those are phenomenal growth rates over a 40-year period. 470% in Hayes County, up to 360 in this county. That's a lot. Okay, no bad news. So where do we go from here? And that's really something to think about. And that's something we've thought about a lot where I work. And this is, I go back to that earlier statement, there's not necessarily a lot of easy answers. And there's plenty of hard work, but there's certainly hope. So we've been looking very hard, in addition to these management tools that we have that do make a difference. Well, what else can we do? What can we find in terms of sustainability tools? So we've taken a really hard look at things like conservation easements, and then different types of conservation practices. And then another component to all that is if people don't understand what you're doing and why, it's really difficult to be successful, right? But the thing that I so admire about this group is it's hard to get this many people interested in one thing in one place in today's society. And I've got two 20-something kids, and it's hard to get them away from this. They don't understand what it's like to be in community at a level that they should understand. And it's kind of sad because I think part of the solution is people who have a common cause and are like-minded and want to make a difference. And it's not easy to make that difference, but it starts here. So I appreciate the opportunity to come give you or share my opinions and what little bit I know. So I want to talk a little bit about the City of San Antonio's program. So part of my Okay, so about 7 of my staff members are dedicated almost full time to annual monitoring of the City of San Antonio's easements. So the city has about 166,000 acres of conservation easements, and they're dominantly located in Uvalde, Medina, and Bexar County, which makes sense for San Antonio because the water in the aquifer moves from west to east. So it's hard for them to justify spending San Antonio dollars east of Bear County. The EAA has on the order of about 6,000 acres of easements. The city of San Antonio to date has spent around $325 million to get those 160 plus thousand acres. They have another 100 million in the pipeline. It's really interesting to me because as a resident of San Antonio, we voted every 5 years, if I remember right, since 2000 to tax ourselves 1/8 of a cent to have these conservation easements. It's just unusual for a big city to have that much foresight. But I think that program is really helpful. I think it makes a big difference. And there's a lot of people that argue things one way or another, and that's fine. But you know, that all that recharge land and even land in the contributing zone is important. You think of it this way: every time you put a conservation easement on a property, you don't have to worry about what else is going to happen to it. So the downside of this, conservation easements are expensive, and it's hard to find enough money to get enough easements, but it's certainly a worthwhile goal. So how does it look region-wide by county as far as the number of acres that are currently protected? So this includes both federal lands, municipal lands, city of San Antonio easements, EAA easements. So everything we could find. And there's a chance that there may be some we missed, but it totals about 230,000 acres across the region. And that's really pretty significant, right? I wish that number was higher. I'm sure we all do. But it gives you some hope, or at least it's some good news, that there's a lot of land under easement. Okay, so we talked about easements. What other things can we do for conservation that are meaningful? So in my 30 plus years as a geologist, I've focused mostly on rocks because that's what we do. And in the last 3 or 4 years, I've learned a lot about rocks aren't the only thing that are important when it comes to groundwater. Turns out that things like vegetation and soil, taking care of your landscape, they can make a pretty big difference in terms of what we call diffuse recharge. So I should probably back up. Recharge in the Edwards Aquifer system is about 700,000 acre feet per year on average for the last 90 years. This year is probably going to be a little lower, but there's dominantly two kinds of recharge. There's a third kind as well, but there's diffuse recharge and discrete recharge. Diffuse recharge is recharge that occurs on the land surface. Discrete occurs inside the stream beds. So with our 150 acre research park, which was a gift from the city of San Antonio to our conservancy, we've started conducting all kinds of land management research and practices to better understand what role that soil plays in the maintenance of diffuse recharge and in water quality. So what we really hope to do is quantify that so that when we have the numbers, when we have the data, it's a lot easier to incentivize that, right? If I know I can take this acre of land and increase its benefit to the system by X amount, then I can talk about that, and I can probably raise money to do more of it. I personally think this is the problem with this work, is the science hasn't caught completely up. But I really think that it's such an important process to maintaining things like air temperature and rainfall and other things. But that's my director of research would not be happy with me for saying that, but because the science really just hasn't caught up yet. But anyway, I'll talk about some of the interesting things that we're doing, and they're really focused on how do we slow down the surface runoff when you do get a rain? How do you soak more water in the ground? How do you keep the soil wet longer? How do you make the vegetation more resilient to drought? So here's an aerial shot of a very small part of the FRP. This is in what we call our demonstration area. So the big indentation in the bottom of the screen used to be a stock tank, but it wasn't really properly constructed. So we turned it into what we call a berm and a swale. And I'll talk a little bit more about those shortly. But we have other features that they're hard to see because the contrast isn't good in this photograph, but these are little boomerang structures. There's about 7 or 8 of them out here. All of those things are surveyed in. So when it rains, all the water that comes across that landscape that you see in the picture gets slowed down. It's like a series of speed bumps. It gets slowed down and then moved to the next thing, to the next thing, and then it collects in the big basin at the bottom and soaks in slowly. And if we get a big enough rain that it bypasses all of that, that's fine. Because we were able to put several thousand gallons of water into the ground that otherwise wouldn't have gone in. This might be easier to make sense of. So a typical berm and swale is just you dig out a very shallow swale and you take the spoil material and put it on the backside, called the berm. You armor that with woody vegetation and cover crops, fill it with mulch. You increase to the extent possible the organic carbon in the soil, and then you wait. And it takes, according to the experts on this, you can expect about 7 years for this to mature. But as it matures, it will infiltrate water more and more quickly. And the vegetation will grow and you'll sequester some amount of carbon, but you'll also shade your soil. You'll keep your land surface temperatures a little cooler. And the net, we hope, and what we're trying to quantify is that the net is a benefit to both diffuse recharge and to things like soil moisture and to maintaining a more drought resilient landscape so that you do have the cooling effect from the trees and from the roots in the ground, all the vegetation. Because one of the things that happens when it gets really hot, if you don't have grasses and trees, and I'm probably preaching to the choir, but is that the surface of the soil heats up, it kills off everything in your soil. So your mycorrhizal fungi, your bacteria, and the things that make your soil healthy and alive, when they get killed off from heat, then it has to regenerate over time. So it takes a long time for your soil to recover if it's bare throughout a hot summer like the one we're currently having. So the picture on the left, your right, I'm sorry, on your right, is actually our first berm that we constructed. So that's the day we finished it. We have a few other practices as well. And kind of the cool thing to me about all these is they're not $100,000 engineered structures that require concrete. They're things that almost any landowner can do. And you don't have to own 100 acres. If you've got an acre in a place that's washing all the time, you can do some simple things to really improve your landscape, but it also improves the health of the soil and perhaps it improves the amount of water going in the ground. So the little one rock dams, me and my staff made those. It was pretty easy. Even I could do it. But you can see, it's really interesting. You can see how much organic material gets trapped behind those one rock rows. Well, in the agricultural world, there's a lot of research that points to for every 1% of organic carbon that you add to your soil, you can increase your water holding capacity between 10 and 20,000 gallons per acre per inch of rainfall. Now, it's unfortunate for me and my staff, we don't have that data for here, so I don't know what the impact is on our soil and in our climate, but that's one of the things that we're trying to do the research on. But then we have rock berms. Rock berms they don't look like much, but they're really, really an interesting thing. As they mature, I'll use this one for an example. So this is on a hillside and it's on contour, as we call it. So it slopes, but it only slopes about 1 foot every 100 feet. So as the steep hillside behind it, as it rains and the water runs off and it picks up all the leaf litter and any soil that's not held in place by roots, it gets trapped on that rock berm. And then what you see happening, this is literally a few days after it was built. Over the next year, I've sat, I go out there and observe and I see, oh, we've got this area with no woody vegetation, but now we have cedar elms coming up in the rock berm, and we have big blue stem coming up, and we have, the list goes on and on. So it creates this environment where, kind of like a nursery, so you start getting your vegetation to repopulate. When the deer come in and eat it. So a lot of this work really, and I mentioned this a minute ago, but it's really kind of focused on the principles of soil health. And this is a handful of this leaf litter and soil debris from our research park. But our goal out there when it comes to soil health is minimize the amount of disturbance. We don't want to plow anything up. We would prefer not to bulldoze anything except where we're making berms. We'll make an exception. But we want as much diversity in our plant life as we can get. Monocultures are just terrible for the environment. Monocultures are just a disaster waiting to happen. As long as you have roots in the ground, you're doing a lot to make soil. Yes, ma'am.
How many acres did you say you have in this practice area, demonstration area?
Well, our eastern tract is 100 acres, but our demonstration area is only about 12 acres right now.
And it's part of the bigger 100 acres. Yeah.
But there's other principles of soil health. Another one is to integrate livestock. Livestock can be really healthy for your land if you don't overgraze them. I'm not an expert in livestock, and we don't have the appropriate facility for livestock. But what I've learned about things other than rocks is when you mow grass, if you don't over mow or overgraze, every time you injure the grass, it starts pumping carbon into the soil. Kind of an interesting concept. I want to go back to school and get 3 or 4 more degrees so I can actually talk to people about this. So why are we doing all these things? Why are we doing all these things and we don't yet have certainty that, oh my goodness, these berms and soils are going to do X and we're going to get this result? Well, we have goals. We want to improve the water holding capacity of the soil, and there's some good evidence that the things we're doing will accomplish that. We need to quantify it to be legitimate. If we can improve that, we can get more water in the soil, if we can infiltrate more water, if we can slow down runoff, can we keep all the sediment out of the streams and all the debris? So we're right on Civil Oak Creek. Our property in some places straddles the creek. And when we get big rainfall events, the creek is just, it looks like chocolate milk, it's just full of sediment. Well, that's not where you want your sediment. There's a lot of recharge that takes place in the creek, but the more fine particles you put into those features, the more you impede the ability to recharge it. Now, occasionally nature gives you a big flood and cleans it all out, but it's just a better idea to keep your sediment on the land surface and on the water bodies. So our desired benefits are, can we make a difference? Can we get more diffuse recharge? Can we sequester some carbon in the process and maintain that clean runoff? And then the hard part, because everything has a downside. We've got a number of people that are working on quantifying these benefits, and it reasonably will take 5 to 7 years to get enough data to be able to say this is the benefit in this area for this climate. But I think it's well worth it. So we will continue as long as my boss allows me. So what I'd like to do now, instead of me talking, I would rather just kind of walk you through just some photographs. So this is that first berm and swale that we built, and we're all really proud of it. Which y'all probably think I'm really weird, but it's just the coolest thing. When we built this, it hadn't rained for several months, so we built it in October of 2020. And our contractor, as he started digging, the soil was extremely moist. You could almost squeeze water out of it. So he put it in place, and so this is October 2020, right after we built it. And we put a layer of compost at the bottom. So this is all compost, this is mulch, and in between, you just fill that area up with cover crop seed. And then you wait, you wait for the magic to happen. So, you know, a month later, we have ryegrass, no rain. I think we may have had 1/10 of an inch of rain or something like that. It was extremely dry. And then snow again here, so that did help. But, so a few months later, we get some woody vegetation installed, and at this particular site, if you don't armor everything that has a green spot on it, it'll be gone. And I used to like deer. I've gotten over that. The other thing they do, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, sometimes if you have something newly planted, they just walk up and pull it up out of the ground. And look at it and walk away. I don't think it is. So March of 2021, then it rained. We got big rain last spring, right? And what we found, at least in this particular vermin swale, is it takes about a couple of hours and all that is soaked right out. And it doesn't fill all the way up, but it fills up substantially and then infiltrates very rapidly. Took this picture a couple of weeks ago. The only thing in this picture that's irrigated is the woody vegetation. So everywhere there's a tree cage, there's a drip line because we invested way too much money in trees to let them die. Once they're established, we won't need to irrigate them. But I'm actually pretty amazed given what little bit of rain we've had this year and the fact that it's been 100+ since May 1st, I think, or it feels that way. It's incredible. It's amazingly green, but we have some really smart people that did all the right things and made this work. So it gives me some hope that there's some things that we can learn, even as a seasoned hydrogeologist type. There's more to the picture than what I realized for a long time. I think keeping that open mind is incredibly important. So some of y'all may have 10,000 acres, and this doesn't apply to you, but for me, you know, I've thought a lot about this over the last few years. What little thing can I do? Because I like to grow stuff, and you know, if I had a lot of land, I would probably have every crop you can think of growing. But I collect rainwater and I use it to water all my plants. Now, obviously, I can't water my yard with it because I can't collect enough because I don't have enough capacity. But it's that's 90 gallons right there, and that's 90 gallons that I use, and it stays full even in a drought. And little things like that. Just and it's a challenge. Like in the neighborhood that I live in, if I fill my flower beds with big blue stems and switchgrass, I'm probably going to get a letter. But I'm probably going to try it anyway. So just kind of a quick summary. What's the EAA's role? Well, we're charged with managing, enhancing, and protecting the aquifer system. And we have a regulatory division. We have my division, and we have other divisions. And we all have our specialty. I don't do the regulatory work. I did that a lot as a consultant. I couldn't wait to get away from it. So I just get to do science now. So I would almost work for free, but I can't afford it. I just really enjoy what I do. I'm lucky. I have a passion for my job. But the role that we play is not always easy. Sometimes people are not happy with us. But the management of the system really makes a difference for everyone. It's not just about any single group or any single permit holder. It's about everyone. So we talked a little bit about how the aquifer works, and that alone could be a 4 or 5 hour talk. And then drought and things like growth. And then all these different pathways for sustainability. Easements are incredibly important. I think easements, this is my opinion based on, this is my professional opinion. Right now, easements bring you the most certainty for a return on your dollar, right? Because we know land management does good things and we think it's going to work, but easements, you know, every time you have an easement that you're going to maintain that much historical recharge, that much historical water quality. You're not going to have potential for a spill. You're going to have a potential for other negative events. So It's a property right state. The only way to really conserve land is to spend money and get an easement. It's difficult, I know, but that's just kind of where we're at. The land management over time, and it may be 5 to 7 years, as I mentioned. Over time, I think that will be it'll be a really great tool in our sustainability toolbox. But I can't, with the way we work, we can't take a trip to Austin and tell the legislatures, oh, wait, we got this great thing, right? Well, once we have the data to support that, then you can start to make statements about, you know, we found this works and it enhances this by this much. That gives us the ability to have the conversation. So we're working very hard on that. And then the education component, talking to people, helping them to understand. It's all important. So with that, I'll just stop and try to answer questions to the best of my ability. Yes, ma'am.
You said something at the beginning that made it sound as if Travis County and Austin are not part of the agricultural authority. But how is that possible? Do you work tightly with them?
We have a really good relationship with the Barton Springs District. So there's a groundwater divided roughly at Onion Creek. So the water there is actually different than the water on this side. So this is the central segment of the aquifer, and it's based on the groundwater divide in Hayes County and the groundwater divide out west. Yes, sir.
You made mention of the drought of 2014. How did that compare with the drought of 2011?
So in my view, that was kind of a continuous drought. We had a wet year or two, but we had several years of abnormally dry weather. And I did a presentation on that very thing some years ago, and I started to have that slide. Now I wish I had, because I don't remember all the details. Me and some of my staff did a rainfall deficit study. And as of about 2014, 2015, right when it started to rain again, we went back and looked at a 13-year period. And rainfall deficits range from 60 or so inches to like 180 inches across the region, depending on where you're at. So I think that drought was potentially more significant than it appeared. We made it through it, which is a great thing, but I think one more dry year it would have gotten really bad. We were fortunate to have that really wet year at the end.
On that 572,000 square acre feet, as you mentioned, what happens if, and are they maxed out at that, as in they're using all of it?
So that 572, that number won't go up.
I understand
It
that,
can only go down. So
but are they maxed out at that right now?
yeah, that's the number of permits. There's 572,000 acre feet of permits.
So we get 3 or 4 different companies coming in and they gotta go into that 572, so the other company's gotta come down.
Right, but if you move here, let's say you move to an open business.
Right.
And you need 10 acre feet of water to make your product. You got to go buy 10 acre feet, or you have to lease 10 acre feet. You can't just drill an industrial well and use that water without a permit. And since there's no more permits being issued, you would have to go buy a permit.
So you have to get it from somebody else who already has it.
Yeah, there's a market, there's an open market for water, you know, so that's actually an interesting point. So prior to the permitting system, the cost of water was essentially, well, how much diesel or electricity does it take to get it from where it is to where I want it? Now the cost of water is much different. So there's a value, financial value or monetary value that wasn't there before.
What is your relationship with the lower Colorado River?
Because we don't really necessarily have one other than we know their staff. One of our goals of late, especially, is we've started working pretty hard to build rapport with all the different whether it's a river authority or a groundwater district or whatever, or a municipality. We've been working to try to build rapport because in our opinion, if we can all come to the table and have conversations about all these challenges that we face, we don't have to always agree, but we can talk about it. And we've done that with several agencies, but we have not done that yet with LCRA. They're on the list. There's a long list. Actually, I'm sorry, before I go, so there's another component to that that I think is worth sharing. So the work we're doing with climate change and trying to model and understand the potential impacts from that. Nobody, according to my staff, they've been working with University of Oklahoma and the South Central Climate Adaptation Center and others. Nobody's done the work yet to look at climate change as it may impact or relate to groundwater. So one of the reasons that we really want to build rapport with all the other agencies is there's no value in taking 10 different approaches to how to model climate change because you wind up with 20 different scenarios and nobody benefits in the end. So our goal is to just, whatever we learn, just to share it. You know, we're paid through aquifer management fees, so in essence, that's public money, and we can lay that on the table and say, well, we did this work. Here's the outcome. If you want to use it, use it. You know, so. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm a retired geologist, studied in San Antonio and Austin back in the dark ages. Back when 1604 was a 2-lane road, smaller than what State Highway 46 is now. In the short amount of time I've lived here, I see Highway 46 turning into 1604, including dense subdivisions and even potentially a major quarry right in the middle of the recharge zone. Have you noticed any decrease in water quality as a result of all this impervious cover, and all the pesticides and insecticides? Quarries use ammonium nitrate and diesel oil, AMPHO. Have you seen anything like that showing up in your water supply?
We spend about, our lab budget is very healthy. It's about $200,000+ a year. And we do a lot of sampling and a lot of looking. And what we found more than anything else is as the technology gets better, you can see trace amounts of things that you didn't see 20 years ago. So things like, depending on where you sample, you may get a hit of something like Comal at 0.03 parts per trillion. So it's not really a big deal. That's not to say there aren't problem areas. There's a couple of areas where there's some historical PCE and PCE spills, so dry cleaner fluid spills. And you know, that stuff doesn't go away very quickly. So we monitor those areas as well. But we haven't seen any trends, but it doesn't mean we're not looking. But just to qualify that, you know, several thousand square miles, it's hard to do that. And, you know, even though we have sampling regimes where we sample the same well multiple times a year to try to see if we miss something. And we sample the springs with regularity because there's a big composite sample of the whole system. But there's so much water in the system, there's some chance that things could be there, but it's just, they're so diluted, it's hard to see them. But we will continue to look. I mean, that's just part of our mission. I'm just gonna go.
Yeah, okay, got the mic. I have a quick question. Do we put effluent water back into the aquifer?
No, not on purpose at least. So, for example, you know, Salt Street, they do a lot of reuse water, but that water is used to provide either industrial use or irrigation use, you know, commercial setting, at least as I understand it. To my knowledge, there's nowhere that treated effluent is being injected. In fact, that would be actually a violation of the EAA Act and state law because you can't put non-Edwards water into the Edwards aquifer.
Quick follow-up to this question. What do you consider to be the biggest contaminant risk around the aquifer area? And do we have an emergency response plan?
That's a hard question. It's hard to answer that with certainty. So, you know, there's always a risk, like a tank truck turns over and spills 2,000 gallons of diesel. We developed, some years ago, we developed rules for gas stations where they have to have triple containment on the recharge zone. And then we put literally a cap on our moratorium on building new gas stations on the recharge zone. So if you want to build one, you have to go buy somebody else's capacity. And because I came out of the consulting world, I strongly agree that that's a very good protective measure. But I'm not sure. From what I've seen in the data, the most common contaminant that you see is dry cleaner fluid. Dry cleaning fluid is so widely used, right? And it's so mobile that it's really easy for it to get in the groundwater.
What is your relationship with GBRA? Exactly what is their function?
Man, y'all are asking all the hard questions. So relationship wise, we know their staff. We try to maintain rapport with them. You know, they don't work for us, we don't work for them. They're governed by a board, much like we are. Yeah, on the upside, I guess, I don't deal with GBRA a lot. But, you know, again, as I mentioned earlier, one of our goals is we think it's good to come to the table with everybody and talk to them. They may never agree with us. We could talk to 200 people and one may agree with us, and that's fine. But I think we get a lot farther by sharing information and trying to work together. Doesn't mean it always works, but I've met with them, you know, I guess twice over the last couple of years, just to show them our field research part and talk to them about the things that I've just talked to you all about. That I didn't dive into anything else. I'm not that familiar with all of their inner workings.
I live on the dry West Fork of the dry Comal Creek, about 600 feet from where Falcon Quarry is scheduled to come in. That quarry sits in the middle of the headwaters of the West Fork of the dry Comal Creek. So everything that you mentioned about conservation, that quarry is going to destroy. It's going to scrape the earth, doesn't have to replace it. And all of that water that's supposed to be held back, that is held back now in times of rain. It takes about 3.5 inches for my portion of the creek to fill with water and go on downstream to go into the aquifers. At that point, this land will be clear scrapes, and we're going to catch all the flood waters because there's nothing to stop it coming down that creek, plus all the contaminants that are associated with that. And we recently discovered that there was a mud formation about yay thick that Mark Allen described as 90 million years old that formed the basin for the Glen Rose Aquifer. And it was right there at the creek. Finally got down to that basin level. And we are directly north of the caverns, natural bridge caverns, Bat Cave, another cave, just adjacent to my property was a spring. And all that water is going to be cut off by this quarry that feeds these caves all along that basin that was the karst, because that's my understanding, karst and the Edwards meet at the natural bridge caverns. Is that correct?
Both the Glen Rose and the
Yeah, the Glen Rose there. Yeah. So the effect of this quarry that's coming in the middle of Comal County is going to be huge. One to the Comal River at the end stage, and two, it's going to be flooding that entire area with contaminants on down into the Edwards. And has there been a study that would address what's going to happen to the water flow as this quarry goes in, and should it even be permitted? Because then the quarry is going to drill, use water to suppress the dust, which is going to evaporate. So that water is gone forever into the air. It comes back as rain eventually. So has anybody ever addressed the effect of this water that's going to, one, clear the land, flood, be evaporated, and on the spring that's right next door to them, and the cave system that's directly south of them, and to the Comal chain, the creek chains? I know that's a long question, but it has to do with water and everything that you cleared out here. We're not conserving that.
Right, and it's a difficult situation. It's difficult for us because we don't have, our agency doesn't have any regulatory power to do anything about that. What we do is we continue to study the system. We continue to take a lot of samples and try to develop good data sets that we can hang our hat on. And I know that sounds like I'm trying to give you the easy answer, but we literally do not have regulatory authority to permit or prevent permitting of any kind of development. You know, we do groundwater permits, and we do in this, the only regulatory component we would have to a quarry is if they're inside of our jurisdiction, and especially primarily that would be on the recharge zone. Then if they have tanks or they have hazardous substances or regulated substances, then we have a team of people that inspect that to ensure they're in compliance with our rules. But we don't have a way to address or stop or impede or change that process. And again, I know it sounds like the easy answer, but we can do the science, and we continue to do the science. And so the location you're describing is, that's interesting because we're downstream, our field research park is downstream of Natural Bridge Caverns on Cibolo Creek. So something we'll keep an eye on to the best of our ability, but we have our own limitations as well.
I have a question that kind of leads into what you're saying. If you're downstream, would it be something to consider to address that dye tracing?
It would be a very difficult dye trace to move something that far. So what could happen is we could wind up in a lot of trouble by, oh, we're going to put 400 pounds of dye in here. We're going to turn 15 or 20 wells green, and then we start getting phone calls for all these issues that come with that. We can do it other ways. So, you know, we've got some pretty talented people on staff who can do amazing things with geochemistry. There's a lot of things going on that we're trying to improve our sampling regime. We're looking at a lot more isotope data than we used to. We've done some other work recently that I think that I'm really not ready to talk about in detail, but we've done some other work that I think might be very interesting and revealing. So we're doing everything we can within the purview of our ability to do so.
I had a question about the permitting process you discussed. So I think based on your answer to his question, all the permits have already been issued that are possible to issue, right?
Right.
So can you elaborate on how that works in the open market? Like, I guess, are those, you mentioned a new business coming to town, is that specifically commercial? Or are we talking about developments? Do those count? And if it's based on acre feet, is there any way to trace how much people are drawing for one particular permit? Because that would seem to be, it would need to be based on volume if they're gonna, does that make sense?
So every well that's regulated has a meter on it. So we know, and people have to report, because our income comes from that usage. So we keep a pretty close eye on those things. There is an open market. I don't remember, but because I don't deal with that with any regularity. There's another division that does. If I remember the numbers correctly, I think west of Civil Creek, an acre foot of water, if you want to buy it, it's like $5,500 or $6,000.
For residential or commercial?
Residential is not regulated.
Okay.
Unless, so, let me see if I can kind of explain what's regulated versus not. So I opened a business, I'm serving customers, I'm regulated. I make money with that water, I'm regulated. I built a house, I have a single domestic well, I'm not regulated. And I'm allowed, I think it's 1.4 acre feet of water per year as a domestic or livestock user. But pretty much everybody else is regulated. Agricultural users have a little bit different fee structure. They pay $2 an acre foot. Everybody else pays $84 an acre foot. But really I guess the only situation I can think of where you would not be regulated is I built a house, I have my own private domestic well, or I have a ranch and I'm watering my cows. But if you're growing crops, you're regulated. If you're serving 3 households, you're probably going to be regulated, right? Because now you're, in essence, you're making money with that water. So the permits, as just to be clear, there will be no more new permits, but you can still buy an acre foot of water on the market, or you can lease an acre foot of water on the market.
Might I ask a quick follow-up? Because I think I'm a little confused. I think it's really important for the permitting part. Like, is there any push from the EAA to potentially be able to limit and apply that to developers? Because I understand there's no limit on residential, but since the majority of the growth is residential, since the permits are max, I'm just curious what the power is to regulate future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. I think I understand where you're going. And it's most of those residential developments are being served by some kind of municipal utility district, whether it's MBU or Canyon Lake Water or whoever. So if that water is coming from the Edwards through that supplier, then that's the regulation point. They either have to go get more permits to serve their customers, or they have to develop alternative supplies. So.
And they're inside the number you said was max or no?
I'm sorry.
Are they inside the maximum number of permits? Like they have to get permits that are within that number you're saying?
Right.
Okay,
So
understood.
like all the municipal suppliers, if they're pulling from the Edwards, they have some number of permits. I think Saws, for example, has about 220 or 30,000 acre feet of permits.
Okay.
And I know MBU has Edwards permits, but they also have Trinity Wells and they have river water, and they're working on building an ASR in the saline zone, which is something that we've collaborated a lot with them on to try to both do our job as a regulator, but also provide some of our technical expertise to help them.
Okay, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So, kind of a related question. How many of the unregulated well, or the usage from the unregulated wells, would be the fraction of that compared, or what would be the relative amount of that compared to 578,000 acre feet?
So our current estimate of domestic and livestock use on an annual basis is about 14,700 acre feet. And that's a really, really difficult number to have any certainty about without knocking on every door. And we do register, so this is another point I should make. We require domestic and livestock wells to be registered. So if there's a spill or another problem, one, we can notify you, but two, it also helps us know, well, this is how much water is actually being used based on this formula. But you may be surprised how much pushback we've received in the state of Texas when you knock on the door and say, hi, we're from the government, we're here to help. There's been literally, I've had people threaten to shoot my staff. For doing that. That's kind of sad.
So you don't have the regulatory authority to administer or to restrict or control what they're doing at the quarry. Who does? Anybody? What gives them the right to go up there and because they own the property, they're allowed to destroy the water that we all use?
Right, it goes through the TCEQ permitting process. And TCEQ looks at it as, and this is what they have to do because it's state law. You're meeting all of these requirements for this permit. therefore you get the permit. And, you know, it's difficult, I recognize that, I understand that, but that's where the law is currently in the state of Texas. These are the things you have to do to conduct this kind of business, and if you meet all the requirements, then it's okay.
I know that like the quarry, they're gonna have to have an EAPP or an SWPPP, you know, they're gonna have to have, they have to have a permit, a water permit to do, to actually do business on top of the Aquifer recharge zone, which is where this is. And why, if they have to get an aquifer protection permit, why can't every aquifer have a little bit more say in that? Does that make sense? Did you understand my question?
Yeah, so you're talking about like the WPAP or water pollution.
Yeah, WPAPs, but it has to go through the EAPP,
Right.
you know, all that.
And we do comment on those things, but we can only comment on, you have to look at it from the eyes of the law. It's like, this is the regulation, this is a requirement. If we see something that concerns us, we'll certainly comment on it, but we can't offer up, oh, well, we want you to do this too, because they're not required to by the law. I know it's difficult, and again, I'm not trying to give you the easy answer, that's the answer.
But how can EAA help us keep something like this, to keep this from going out of the officer? How can EAA help our organization and the people in this community
Right.
to stop this? Or
Right.
to at least have the tools to be able to fight? Does that make?
It does, and I empathize if that helps at all. But, so what we can do is we can do science. We have some really good scientists, and if we could prove that, oh, this creates this issue in this location, and we can tie it directly to that, then we have something to work with. Or if, you know, if we can facilitate, the reason easements are awesome is it's a public-private partnership where everybody gets along and it works. So it costs money. You don't make money with an easement, all you do if you're a landowner. But, right, it's not like a business where I'm gonna sell this aggregate and I'm gonna make some money from it. So, again, we have to always, from where I sit, and I mentioned earlier, I don't work in the regulatory realm. But I know from my very good friend who runs that division, who's an attorney and knows way more about the law than I will ever know. He's made it very clear to me, he's helped me to really understand. Here's the law, right? And if I check all the boxes and I'm in line with the law, there's not anything that PCDQ can do to prevent issuing a permit. And we're about 100 times more limited, other than, you know, we can try to get more easements. We can try to do the science. We can try to find what we can find and understand things better. And if we see something that's a detriment, then we have a case in the court of law. It goes that way, right?
Right. Well, we're in the court of law right now. So my question is how can EAA help us with this research and to get the answers that we need so that we can find this in the court of law that we're already in?
Right. Well, we continue to take samples. Go ahead.
So regulate water and permits, but you have no regulatory power. So who affirms or approves what data you collect? In other words, what particular project or research focus you have? Does that get shut down if you try to do it in a particular area? Are you regulated by your data?
No, not yet, and hopefully never will be. But here's the problem. I'm glad you asked that question. So here's a longstanding problem you have, especially in a state like this. I grew up here, so it's okay. I can say this without anybody shooting at me. But it's hard to get access, right? There's so many places where if we could have had access to wells, we could have gone in 20 years ago. We could have collected some good data, and we could have been collecting data for 20 years. But I'm not exaggerating when I say there's been so many cases where we've tried to get access to things over the last 20 years, and people were, there's a lack of trust, right? Well, you're from the government. Yeah. But I really am here to help. No, you're not. So it's hard, and usually when there's an issue, then that's when you get access. So we've been down this path before with other issues in other counties where people are upset, and I understand. But again, all we can do is X. So we've talked to a lot of those people and said, you know, if you want to give us access to your property, we'll come and start testing the wells, and we'll build a data set. And if things change, and I know this is the sad part, but then if things change, then we can understand, oh, there was an impact from this, and here's the data to prove it. So it has to be done.
Have you pursued, research specifically on the impact of the quarry industry? And if not, why? Then would you get shut down?
I don't think we would get shut down.
I mean, not shut down, but I mean, the project in itself.
I don't think it would be, but it's a non-trivial task. So I'm going to go back to my 30 staff members who are all great people, and they work really hard. Most of them actually work way more than 40-hour week. We have this research part where we're trying to quantify the benefits of land management. And then we're out sampling across this, 8,000 square mile area. And we have dozens of other things. We have 75 rain gauges across the region because we need those rain gauges and weather stations to be able to estimate recharge so that we can build a model so that we can ensure our management techniques work. So I could go on and on and on. It's just that we all have so much on our plate. And we're always trying to stretch the limits of, yeah, we can go in here and try to sample these 6 or 8 wells if we get access, and we can try to learn something. But to take on a specific program where we're going to go out and we're going to properly research the impact of the quarry, well, that's a few $1 million, and it's most of my staff dedicated to that one thing for a period of years. And I couldn't do that without my board approval. But if I do that, even if the board told me that's fine, then I have to let these other things go. And it's likely that the quarry is going to happen anyway, but I can do these things that hopefully make a difference. And if we can prove this and figure all this out, maybe one day we can go back to these quarries and turn them into something useful when they're done. I've tried to come up with the solutions as bad as everybody else is, but it's not as easy as it seems. Hang on. I'm gonna have to get a little more water.
In reference to signage around this particular subject that they're talking about, the broken quarry, there's a state sign that says Edwards Aquifer Recharge Zone, sensitive area. Number one question is, who determines that verbiage for that sign?
That sign's probably ours, and probably somebody on staff 20 years ago that determined that verbiage. But
I think it's accurate. But the question is, what does sensitive mean?
I think
It's supposed to be a directive as to not develop over this sensitive area, i.e. your recharge zone?
it is designed to raise awareness, but again, going back to, there's not a lot more that I can do. I can't create a regulation. Yeah, we all recognize it's a sensitive area, and it is, but I have to play within the guidelines that I have to play within.
We understand those are pretty narrow. Thank you.
One more question regards that. Can you, since I'm in close proximity, if you sample my well, would you sample the spring that's been active on my neighbor's property for the last 100 years is still an active spring even during the drought? Would those be of interest to you for data?
Absolutely. Yeah, because that whole basin is of interest to us, right? Because we have Comal Springs just downstream of that. Right. And we've all seen dry Comal when we get a big rain, and it's like white chalk flowing down the dry Comal, and it goes in with, the Comal River. We would love to sample that, and I think we can pretty easily make that happen. Because that's an area where It fits in well with our existing research plan already.
Okay, so just an overview and,
Yeah, I'll give you my contact information number. I may not have a voice left by then, but I can.
neither will we.
Yes, sir.
I live really close to that, so that's kind of important too. But it's a slightly different subject with the population growth in San Antonio and surrounding areas, and the more people that are now drawing on the aquifer than ever before, and the accompanying impervious, roadways, mountain houses, and whatnot. How does that correlate to the 572,000, or just the capacity in general? At what point is there a tipping point? What is that? Do we know? How many
It's
people
not gonna be any easy questions. But- So all of those things are great questions because one, the majority of those individual wells right now are going into the Trinity system, not the others. Yeah. And a lot of the growth that's in the San Antonio area, it's being fed by some kind of utility district, whether it's solid or something else. Cumulative effect, well, we know about what domestic use is now. If it doubled, say it doubles by 2050, it's still not a terrible number. But the day, this is my opinion, and I hope I don't get fired for saying this. So I'm qualified with this, is just my opinion. But I think the day could come where there's so much domestic use that it has to be regulated a little more tightly. But those are all very real and very concerning questions. How many more places can we pave over? What does it do? A lot of the recharge is still going to happen because the majority of recharge is discrete and happens in stream beds. But how much heat does it add to the atmosphere for every other mile of road that we put in? How much do we lose for every rooftop? And I don't have the answers to those things.
Well, this comes from a place of we've been for the past, over the last 20, 30, whatever years, we've had water rationing. And then now we have more people and we've actually had to drop our well deeper since then. So that's what this comes from.
Yeah, I absolutely understand. And I trying to remember, was it the 2007 and 8 drought? For those of you that were around this area back in that time, I remember a lot of the Trinity wells in Blanco started going dry because of the drought. And people were very concerned, rightfully so. And I don't know where this all goes necessarily because there's always going to be, every resource has its upper limit. You can use it this much. The beauty of the